Hello everyone and welcome back. Queen Charlotte was just released and we're taking it back to the 1760s with this offshoot of the Bridgerton series from Netflix. And I realized that though my expertise as a fashion historian actually really got started in the late 18th century, so this is my era that I really know really well, I've not talked about it on here before, or at least not very much. So I thought it was only appropriate that I would take this opportunity to talk about that time period and introduce you to it. I'm going to be doing a lot more videos in the relatively near future on the 18th century coming up later this year, so if you are interested at all in this time period, I definitely recommend sticking around. As for today, I know I get a lot of requests to just straight up review different types of modern media adaptations of historical things, but in reality, most of the time they're not even trying to be historically accurate. The entire Bridgerton series is a great example of that. They are not trying to be accurate. They very much state at the beginning that they are not, and that's perfectly fine. They are going to be taking liberties stylistically for many different reasons. So they're not trying to be historically accurate, but they are very heavily historically inspired. So I thought what we could do instead is sort of an introduction, a 101 to the 1760 to 1785, the height of the Georgian period, and honestly the time period that they've kind of smushed into this series, because though it takes place over a few months, the styles are from about a 25-year period that we're looking at. So this is going to be an introduction to that era. We're going to learn about the different garments, the terminology, a lot of really useful information. Even if you haven't seen Queen Charlotte and have no intention of, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to have seen it to understand this video, and there are no spoilers in this as well. So this is just going to be a little bit of a guided tour through that era in fashion, because there is so much to see. First off, we need to understand how clothing is made, not just physically sewn. In fact, everything in this time period is hand sewn. The sewing machine is not an invention just yet, or at least they haven't figured out a good one yet. So everything is being hand sewn at this time period, and it's being hand sewn by professionals. When you go shopping, whether as an everyday person going shopping in England or Europe or America, or as the gentry and the royals, you're going to be having a pretty similar experience, in fact. So if you need accessories, you're going to the milliner for those. They're going to be taking care of all of the kerchiefs and caps and hats and ruffles and all sorts of different things. And they're going to have unfitted garments such as shirts, things that are big and loose and don't really need sizes in quite the same way, just a broad range. You can buy those in packs of dozen or half dozen because they're underwear. You're going to need a lot of them. So that's really the only time you're going to be able to walk into a store, sit down, have them hand you different objects, and you can walk out the store with whatever you want. When it comes to fitted clothing, suits, gowns, things of that nature, that's going to be custom made. And that doesn't matter who you are. You're not making your own clothing at home, because even if you are of the working class or working in the trades, you have work to do, you have money to earn, and it doesn't take that long for a professional to make something. But if you don't know what you're doing, there's no instructions, there are no books, there are no sewing patterns, you have no help in this, and you can go do what you're good at for a full day, and then go do what they're good at for a full day, and essentially you'll probably be getting paid a pretty similar amount, so you might as well spend that day doing something you know how to do and not spend 3 or 4 days trying to make that gown that would take a professional one day. In fact, the cost doesn't come from things being custom made. It comes from the fabric. So everyone's going to be going to the tailor or the mantua maker, depending on what they need. The tailor takes care of the men's suits, as well as the ladies' riding habits, which are styled a bit like men's suits, ladies' court gowns, because they require a lot of structure to them, as well as ladies' stays, which are the support garment for women in this era. So we're going to talk a lot more about those later, but because of the way that they are built, by way of taking measurements and making up patterns, and structurally built like architecture, they are made by the tailors. And the gowns and things that are draped upon the body and do not have that structure are made by the mantua maker. Eventually becomes the gown maker and the dress maker, just based off of how we term that garment. So mantua makers in this time period are making so many different types of women's fashion and a little bit of men's too. And those are the main trades that we're expecting to go to. So first, you would go and buy your fabric. You get to choose from literally thousands of options, because fabric is one of the biggest parts of the economy in the 18th century, It is coming from all over the world. They have linen, cotton, silk, and wool, and a few other odd things we're not going to worry about today, but they have a huge range of all of those, from very cheap to very expensive. Even the very cheap silks can be far less expensive than a middling sort of wool. So you have a huge range of price points that you can choose from. And you can therefore get something very cheaply made but very fashionable, or very expensively made and very out of style. Just depends on what you feel like doing. Once you've chosen your fabric, you are going to have a pretty good understanding of how much yardage you're going to need depending on what you're doing, because you've done this for your entire life. You take those fabrics off to the tailor or the mantua maker and explain to them exactly what you want, and they'll make it up. So you can have a very expensive suit or a very cheap suit. It all comes down to the quality of the fabric, which, speaking of quality fabric, it's the perfect time to take a moment to thank the sponsor for this week's video, Brooklinen. Brooklinen has a wide range of luxury home goods focusing on high-quality textiles, and their luxury goods don't come with an over-the-top luxury price. I came across Brooklinen years ago when I was looking for towels that would actually last and not cost me a fortune. Since then, I've fallen in love with their sheets as well. Natural fibers and quality textiles have always been an important part of my life. And if I'm going to make sure that that's the case for my clothing, why not my sheets as well? I'm going to be spending a third of my life in bed, and it's so important to have a comfortable and good night's sleep. It's not just about being soft, though they get softer with every wash, is making sure that your temperature stays balanced so you don't wake up constantly throughout the night. Personally, I'm a fan of their linen sheets for that reason. They stay so fresh and keep me comfortable all night, no matter what the temperature. And they have so many different options for color and style. You can mix and match all sorts of colors and patterns. I got the hardcore bundle, which not only has the core sheet set, but also extra pillowcases and a duvet cover, and you save 25% over individual items that way. Then you can have fun creating a distinct style for your bedroom. I love changing my net for the seasons and bringing in bright colors as it warms up. So head on over to their site to play around with creating a new and fresh design. And Brooklinen is offering my viewers a special discount of $20 off any order over $100. Just click the link below and use my code Rudolph. Thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring this week's video. Now on to our shopping trip. We've gotten our fabric, we've taken it to the tailor or the mantua maker, and we need to tell them what we want to have. So the styles, the fashions are coming from all over the world. France is definitely a central source for this. They are known for the most elaborate and extravagant fashions. In fact, the British constantly make fun of the French for being over the top, and the French make fun of the British for being dowdy and plain. It's a constant thing going on, but every single region has their own variations on these styles. And the inspirations for the French come from so many places, whether it is the gentry or actors, or perhaps all sorts of international trade. So inspiration, especially in the form of textiles, can come from all over the world. This is definitely a global economy, and we are not really isolated at this point in time. So fashion isn't either. There's actually a wonderful example of this in Queen Charlotte, where Charlotte, who is from Europe, has a wedding gown in a more French style that she's bringing with her. But she gets over to England and is told, perhaps you should go with a more practical English style of wedding gown, which makes perfect sense. Not only in the idea of you should tone it down a little bit, because they still would have had extremely elaborate courtwear in England during this time. It's not like it would have been plain and boring, but more so in the sense of you should support the local economy. You should support small local businesses. Spitalfield silk is really your better option. If you're going to be representing a country, you should perhaps support the local trades. So that may be more of a concern for the royal family, but as for the average person, they're looking for inspiration from all over the world for these styles, though, a lot of fashion plates might be coming over from France to show them what the latest styles are there. Now, breaking down what we're seeing in these outfits next, we're looking at the men. We start with the shirt. The shirt is the undergarment, the total body undergarment. And it's usually made out of a white linen because it's something that you can then bleach and wash and put it out in the sun to make sure that it's really nice and clean, because it is your underwear and it needs to be cleaned. And the shirt is pretty long because it tucks between the legs and serves as that underwear. There are under breeches that can go over those, but those are less for underwear, though they look a bit more like boxers to us today than they are so much a separate lining. Not surprisingly, over that we have our breeches, and those are essentially short trousers. And trousers do exist, but they are most commonly worn by the military or by those who are doing physical labor, farmers and the like. They might also be worn for hunting purposes or things in a slightly more fashionable sense, but it's not high fashion, and it's not even everyday fashion for the everyday person. Breeches are far more common. They fasten just below the knee with a knee band that actually helps to hold up those tall stockings so that way they don't slouch back down again. And then they actually, interestingly enough, sit pretty low. So much like our modern men's styles, they don't sit really high at the waist, they sit pretty much over the hip bone area. So they're surprisingly modern in their styling in that way, though admittedly they close with a bunch of different buttons. They lace up in the back at the waistband so they're a little bit adjustable. All of the buttons in the front. By the time we reach the 1760s, the off front is what's going to be the more common style rather than center front closure. So rather iconic of the time period to have that, but that's important because the waistcoat is starting to get shorter. So earlier on in the century, that waistcoat that goes over this has a very long, what we call skirt around the bottom. And as that rises up suddenly, well, quite frankly, the crotch area of the gentleman's clothing is much more visible. So having a nice flat amount of fabric in front seems to be the ideal, and that's why they end up going with that newer style of drop front rather than the center front closure. The waistcoat, as I mentioned, is getting shorter and shorter as we go up. So by the 1760s, it's pretty decent length. By the 1780s, it's pretty darn short and actually will lose all of that length entirely as we get into the next century. They usually have pocket flaps to balance out the length. Lots of buttons down the front, though they don't usually get buttoned all the way up to the top. A little bit of the cravat that ties about the neck is usually visible at the top area there. It's also honestly more comfortable to not have that stiffness up the top of your neck. So these come in styles that are sleeved or unsleeved, and they do specify sometimes or not in other times. So it's kind of difficult to give a judgment as to how common it was. Most of the surviving examples don't seem to have sleeves, but they are considered not the outermost garment. You wouldn't be wearing your waistcoat with your shirt sleeve visible without being in a more casual circumstance. So over that goes the coat, most typically. There are, again, jackets in this time period, but those are for more workwear and casual wear, also really popular for hunting wear as well, just because they're a little bit more practical to move and do physical work in. But the more fashionable style is the coat, and that at this point has a fairly long, large, voluminous skirt. It's pleated up and back so it's not constantly showing just how large it is, but it does have a fair bit of fabric pleated in there. That does start to reduce as we move forward through the century, and in fact by the time we reach the 1780s, there's a lot less pleating going on, a lot less fabric. Even the front of the coat has started to cut away further and further. We'll eventually stop buttoning it in front and we'll actually just hook it because it barely meets up at the chest, and they go towards a more exaggerated posture with a really puffed out chest as we reach the end of the century. But in the 1760 point, they're still a little on the voluminous side, not nearly as exaggerated of a front shape. We still have some pretty big cuffs going on. Those will also reduce over the coming decades, and still plenty of buttons, pocket flaps down at the front as well. So that's the general suit of clothes. Sometimes it is all matching, what we call in ditto. Sometimes they are mismatched. In fact, it becomes more popular to have coordinated suits rather than matching suits as we make our way further into the century. There are also a huge range of accessories that they don't really get into very much with the series. You're going to very regularly see hats. There were very few hats in the show, surprisingly, but there would have been things like the tricorn that we typically think of, which is just one style of what we call a cocked hat, and that can be 1, 2, or 3 sides cocked up with different proportions and different styles of trimming. So that gives us a wide range of different types of hats that would have been worn in the era. As for the trimmings, which was definitely the most iconic part of the series, yes, there would have been a lot of embroidery and what we call lace trimming in this era when it comes to the court dress. So not only do we expect to see that embroidery, which is very typical of the time, they would have been embroidered in these large panels by professional embroiderers and then sold as is, so that way the tailor can cut it up. It's a great little feature if you ever get to see these up close as antiques, where they have to split things in order to shorten them or lengthen them. But embroidery would have been very common on these, as well as gold and silver work, as well as lace. Not just the lace that we're used to today, but lace as in this gold and silver trim. So they especially show this on all of the military uniforms, on the livery. However, this also would have been present on plenty of non-uniform clothing in that era as well. It's a really quick way to apply a large amount of trim without having to have something pre-embroidered. So that's a good overview of what we're expecting to see for the men's attire. As for the women's, they have an even wider range of things. So we're going to start off with the really basic stuff again, with the shift, which is much like the shirt, the entire body undergarment, protecting the body from the clothing and vice versa. So the sweat and the oils from the body go into this garment. It gets gets washed and scoured and cleaned really well, and you're going to be changing that out multiple times a day if you need to, at least every day, so that way your clothing doesn't get nearly as dirty and doesn't need nearly as much cleaning. Women will also have the same stockings that the men do. Machine knitting has been around for 200 years by that point, so we've got a really good handle on how to very quickly do that sort of stocking style. And over that, you can choose to put your under petticoat, which can help with the shape of the gown that will go over that, sort of giving you more volume, holding things out. But it can also be a matter of warmth, or in the summer, it can help keep the skirts away from your legs. So the under petticoat is all those things plus cleanliness. If you're realizing at this point that I'm not going to mention any other sort of women's undergarments like we're used to, and you have questions, I highly recommend checking out Abby's video on the history of menstruation, because it goes into far more detail about how women would have dealt with that in the past. But those are the basic under layers for women's garments. Over this we have the stays, which, as I mentioned, are the structural undergarment. These are the support garment. They support the bust as well as the back. They make sure posture is appropriate and you can sit perched on the edge of something for a long period of time without really getting tired. They also support the weight of all of those big skirts, which is especially important when we're looking at the big fancy formal things. You definitely don't want to tie those just around your waist. It'll be very uncomfortable. But this is not a garment that pinches and pulls and reduces the waist. Tight lacing in this era is as much a joke as it is in the 19th century, but you'll note that the tight lacing is pulling from the top. They're not reducing at the waist, they are in fact pulling the shoulders together for that tight lacing, over-exaggerating the posture and sticking out the chest. You're going for a conical shape, not a curvy shape that nips in at the waist, and usually they add a couple of inches to the body rather than reducing it based off of my personal experience. The overall structure is achieved by way of baleen. So we colloquially call it whale bone, but it is not bone. It does come from whales though. It comes out of their mouth. They filter krill through that. So it's the same keratin that is in our nails and our hair. It's very flexible when it's cut into small strips, and it actually will mold and shape to the body with heat and moisture. On top of the stays, we now have to add a little bit more structure potentially. So in court dresses and fancy dresses, formal dresses, we're dealing with side hoops or full hoops. The side hoops are called panniers in French, which is a reference to little saddlebags that are being worn by donkeys or mules, but in English they are called side hoops. And these not only give the fashionable shape to the gown, but also can serve as a place to store a lot of things. If you don't have side hoops or hoops, then you have separate pockets, and you can honestly have both, but the pockets will just tie about the waist and hold all of the different things that you need for the day, and you can just transfer them from outfit to outfit so you don't have to keep changing out purses. So we have that as our base understructure, depending on what sort of fashion you need, which is an external skirt, and then we have the gown or the jacket. There's a wide variety of different styles of gowns and jackets in this time period, but it really boils down to mostly 3 different styles of backs and 3 different styles of fronts. So we have the sack back, which is the big pleated loose back. We have what is sometimes termed an English back, which is a pleated down version of this, so it's stitched down with a lot less fabric involved in that. A little bit less formal, definitely more popular in the 1760s and into the 1770s. It starts to fade out in favor of the Italian back, or sometimes called the quarter back, and this is stitched together separate pieces. So we have seams rather than pleats. In front, you have the stomacher style with that separate triangular stomacher in front. Again, more formal, a little more antiquated. You also have the center front closing style, which is what really picks up as the 1770s go on. And then you also have the more cutaway style, which can still be a center front closure. Sometimes it's a completely separate stomacher. And this sort of also encompasses a few other styles, such as polonaise gowns, which is a cutaway style, but it's a loose body, so we don't have a waist seam. There are also plenty of other jacket styles, which are based off the gown styles, such as the sack back can be shortened and turned into what we term a pet en l'air, which, yes, literally means fart in the air. I'll let you guess how the story came about for that term. And there are so many other types of jackets in a variety of styles as well. So there are tons of different combinations in terms of the bodice shapes and fits, in terms of how the skirts are pulled up and gathered up or left long and straight. The sleeves go from being 3/4 length to long sleeve once we reach the 1780s as the fashionable trendy type. So there are tons of different changes in the base of the gown as well as all of the trim. And the jackets follow suit with all of that. So we see all these different styles in the show, all of these different cuts, so many different trims, pleated trims, gathered trims, ruffles, and gold and silver and fly fringe and all sorts of different things are all over the place. Notably, another style also exists that I saw quite a bit in the show, which is the riding habit that I mentioned earlier, still being made by the tailors. This is a more masculine style garment, though most of the examples we're seeing in the show are being especially worn by the king's mother, and she is wearing a lot of silk versions, which are less for riding and sporting and more for travel garments. So a lot of the riding habits we see pictured are going to be in wool and much more durable and practical, and you see a lot more jackets in silk than you will see riding habits, but there is an in-between to this as well. And I particularly want to note this just because I found it especially interesting to notice when she's wearing the more formal traditional gowns on that end of the extreme, or whether she's wearing the more masculine style riding habits. She kind of chooses two very different characters depending on the situation she's in. So that was a fun little feature for me to notice. There are also plenty of examples of a style that comes off of the riding habit in the 1780s and 90s called the redingote. And that style of jacket has often some pretty big collars. And I think that helped to inform some of the ensembles that Queen Charlotte is wearing through the series as well. So though her things are decidedly a bit more modern in their styling at certain points, they do have some inspiration from the 18th century, though maybe not from 1760s. And as for the rest of the women's garments, it mostly comes down to accessories. They don't show a lot of accessories. They don't show cloaks or mantles. There aren't a bunch of kerchiefs and aprons, which there really should be. They were all not only functional, but fashionable versions of all of these. Kerchiefs were particularly popular because it meant that you could prevent sunburn, as well as staying warm in the winter, or just finishing off the neckline of the gown. If you don't have what's called a tucker, which is a little ruffle that fits around that neckline, you need something else to finish it off. It's not a matter of modesty. They definitely weren't modest about their necklines and chests in this era, so that wasn't the issue so much as just looking finished and polished and put together. Which, on that note, I do have to commend them for the fact that pretty much every example of women's hair in the show, they have it up. They have it styled in some way, which is what would have happened. If women didn't have their hair up and styled, they would have had it under a cap. The thing is, you have to remember they lived in a world full of smoke from fireplaces, of dust and dirt, on a level that we're not accustomed to today, and the hair would get very dirty very quickly if you don't keep it covered, especially if you're, say, working in a kitchen. So they used caps as the replacement for bothering to put your hair up in elaborate styles every day, and basic hair care was done by way of pomade and powder, because washing it and letting it dry without a hairdryer was not terribly practical for a good portion of the year. Too cold, not really the best for your health, so they relied on what is essentially leave-in conditioner and dry shampoo. Again, I reference Abby if you want to see more about this, because that is her area of expertise and she knows so much about hair care in the 18th century. Needless to say though, they put a lot of time and effort into caring for their hair and keeping it clean, so it wouldn't have been down, out, and loose, flowing about and getting tangled and dirty and dealing with all of those problems that would have been so much more difficult to deal with historically. But that covers a pretty good general idea of the different styles and garments that we're going to be seeing in this third quarter of the 18th century. There are so many other details that we just don't have time for. I'm going to be spending a lot more time, starting probably up around August, with each major type of garment, making a full men's suit, making a pair of stays, a new gown, all of those things. So definitely come back if you want to see more details about those. As for my overall reaction to Queen Charlotte, it's definitely not meant to be accurate, and I'm not going to judge it based off of that. I do want to note, however, where it does differentiate. Not only in the fact that it doesn't really show a lot of accessories, which can be incredibly tedious and time-consuming to try and get those together. Also, obviously the hair, though I commend them for having it up, is not terribly accurate. It is a stylistic version for women's hair, and the men's hair is left incredibly modern with being cut so short. They would have also had longer hair, but also in the general fit of the clothing, there is so much time and knowledge that goes into fitting 18th century clothing properly in the era, let alone figuring out how to do it from a modern perspective. So 18th century men's clothing, for example, would have been fit with much more narrow shoulders than we're typically seeing for modern adaptations of it. It would have been much tighter up in the armholes, so that way it provides a lot of movement without disturbing the fit of the coat. And just in general, menswear is going to be a lot more fitted historically because they have the time and the knowledge and the ability to do that by having each piece be custom made rather than we're trying to outfit literally dozens of people. That's not something that is going to work well for modern theatrical adaptations. Same thing goes for women's wear. You're going to see differences in fit and proportions where trim is going to be applied that maybe isn't quite what they proportionally would have chosen historically, so it can feel a little bit off with something being a little bit too big, a little bit overwhelming, something not quite balancing right with the gown. So that's a pretty typical thing to see in modern media adaptations of historical things in general. And that's the stuff that they would have had a very different eye for. But overall, the look, the feel of evoking that part of the 18th century, I think was done incredibly well, considering that the accuracy was not their point, and they have such a wide range of great examples of different styles and colors and elements that I feel like very often get overlooked from modern adaptations of the 18th century. So I definitely commend them for doing that. Just know that there is such a limited aspect of what you're seeing on the screen, and that there's so much more to explore from this particular era in time than they'll ever be able to put in one small series like that.